Corti Brothers was established back in 1947 by Frank and Gino Corti. As the sons of Italian immigrants, they were frustrated by the lack of shops carrying European food at the time, and when they opened Corti Brothers, it was one of the only stores in Northern California to do so. The shop is still a specialist grocer in Delhi today, and it's still in the original location on Folsom Boulevard in Sacramento, California, where it's run by Frank's son Darrell, who's widely regarded as a legendary figure in the food and drinks world in the US. Frank Corti saw his shop as more than just somewhere to buy exotic produce, but as somewhere that would educate and provide new and exciting experiences for customers. He primed Darrell from a young age to become the embodiment of that vision. If he and the shop weren't so inseparable, it would be a difficult argument to decide which of the two was his greater achievement. The food writer Coleman Andrews has described Darrell as knowing more about food and wine than anyone else in the world, and as it turns out, he knew a thing or two about whiskey as well. He made the Corti brothers' first foray into the whiskey world in the mid-1970s, travelling to Kentucky to meet with Gordon Hugh and seek out cask to bottle as a special bourbon for the US bicentennial in 1976. Even at this early stage, his refined and highly selective palate was on full display, and he turned down casks from the warehouses of big names like Maker's Mark and Old Crow. Instead, he showed incredible foresight to select what would have been an unfashionably well-aged bourbon from Willett Distillery, two elements that command a huge premium in the market today. This approach, of course, saw him cross paths with Julian Van Winkle in the 1980s, and they went on to collaborate on some of the most sought-after bourbon releases of all time. Having enjoyed his experiences in Kentucky, Darrell quickly turned his attention to Scotland and imported his first exclusive single malts in 1978. His wine connections put him in contact with Avery's of Bristol, who had an impressive collection of casks for him to choose from. Within it, he found exceptional examples from the likes of Macallan, Highland Park and Glenfarclas. When you talk about these legendary figures like Darrell Corti and Silvano Samaroli and their fine-tuned palates, it's perhaps inevitable that they both end up seeking out casks from the same source. This, of course, was Cadenhead's, Scotland's oldest independent bottler. Their warehouses were a treasure trove of casks built up for well over 100 years by this point. Cadenhead bottled the Corti Brothers selections through their R.W. Duthie subsidiary between 1983 and 1986. The single malts that Darrell selected had no grander intentions beyond that of the Corti Brothers shop, which was simply to offer Americans the finest produce that Europe had to offer. And having achieved that, they had in no way expected the bottles to become the sensation that they are today. One of the most striking and significant things about Darrell Corti as an individual is his humility. Despite all of the things that are said about him, if you pressed him to describe himself, he would simply tell you he was a grocer. When describing the shop, he says things like, "We sell traditional balsamic, we sell fresh truffles, we also sell toilet paper." This endearing nature of his personality really shines through in the way the Corti Brothers whiskies are presented. Where bottles like Samaroli's went all in on their branding and label aesthetics, the Corti Brothers by contrast have a classic and now iconic simplicity. These bottles are a perfect representation of the Corti Brothers ethos, which sought to position them as the bottler as no more than simply the conduit for the product. They had only two concerns when these were bottled: their customers and offering them the best whiskey that they could find. Despite that humble objective, however, these bottles have found their way from that shelf somewhere between the deli meats and the toilet roll and onto those of the world's most celebrated whiskey collectors, and they're some of the most sought after ever to have been produced. Among the collection highlights are some of the early 1978 bottlings from Avery's of Bristol, including a rare vatting of two 1969 vintage casks of Glenfarclas. It's odd to see Glenfarclas named on an independent release, but 78 was the year prior to the distillery taking control of bottling for their brand, so this narrowly escaped the strict naming rules and various pseudonyms we are familiar with today, although it may have been fun to see what Corti came up with. From the Duthie's bottlings, one of the standouts is the 1966 vintage Jura. A rich sherry cask single malt, R.W. Duthie bottled a sister cask for Samaroli in the same year, and both are regarded as exceptional island whiskies. The star of the show, however, is undoubtedly the 1965 vintage Clynelish. Distilled at the distillery we now know and love as Brora, this is one of the final vintages before the distillery's first closure and subsequent transition to heavily peated whiskey. Production from every year at the distillery is revered, however those from the original Clynelish in the 1960s are regarded as some of the most exceptional single malts ever made. With bottles of this rarity, opportunities to acquire them just don't come up very often. Platforms such as Whisky Auctioneer offer you the best chance to do so. Our knowledge and expertise means you can be confident in what you are buying, and our services are available to anyone with an internet connection.